Martin Luther King Jr. The man that changed society.
In the 1920s, hundreds of thousands African Americans joined the Great Migration from the South to industrial cities in the North. By moving to the North, African Americans thought they could escape the segregation in the South, find economic opportunities, and build better lives. Although discrimination and economic inequality remained the norm in northern cities, the North still offered much greater economic opportunities for African Americans compared to the South. The living conditions were not good in the 1920s. 45% of poor black families with children experienced overcrowded housing, food insecurity, or unmet medical needs. World War I set the stage for African Americans to re-enter federal politics in the United States, although perhaps not in the way many expected. The Great Migration of African Americans to the North to take jobs in war factories had a significant impact on the political power of African Americans in the United States as well. As their numbers grew in city neighborhoods, African Americans became a powerful voting bloc that could sometimes sway the outcome of elections. At election time, most African American voters in the North voted for the Republican Party. In 1928, African American voters in Chicago achieved a significant political breakthrough. Voting as a bloc, they helped elect Oscar the Priest, the first African American representative in Congress from a northern state. During his 3 terms in Congress, the Priest introduced law to oppose racial discrimination and make lynching a federal crime. In the case Plessy versus Ferguson was decided that laws that segregated African Americans were permitted as long as equal facilities were provided for them. After this decision, laws that segregated African Americans and whites spread quickly. These laws were called the Jim Crow laws. These laws segregated public facilities like buses, trains, schools, restaurants, pools, and parks. The public facilities for blacks were of poorer quality than they were for whites. The organization NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, battled hard against segregation and discrimination against African Americans, but had no success yet.
Based on the incident involving the seamstress Rosa Parks at December 1st, 1955, in which she refused to give her seatplace to the bus to a white man, the black community decided to start a bus boycott. It became famous as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. For many people, it marked the beginning of the civil rights movement. It was also the event Martin Luther King Jr. became famous for. He got appointed to lead the boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, short called the SCLC. SCLC was established in 1957 to coordinate the action of local protest groups throughout the South. Under King's leadership, SCLC drew on the power and independence of black churches to support its activities. In 1963, King and SCLC joined with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, known as the ACMHR. Its goals was to convince people to hold nonviolent protests like kneel-ins at churches, sit-ins at the library, and a march on the county building to register voters. King convinced many people with his powerful speeches and his reasonable explanations. He got arrested for his lead in the protest, just as many other protesters. In jail, he wrote a letter, known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, to explain his goals and the reasons of the civil rights movement. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963 at the March of Washington. He asked in it for equality and the end of racism and discrimination against African Americans. In 1965, King led thousands of nonviolent demonstrators in the March from Montgomery, Alabama, to Selma, Alabama, to register black citizens to vote. The protesters faced brutal violence by the police and other citizens in response. In 1966, King and the SCLC announced plans for a campaign that marked the expansion of their civil rights activities from the South to northern cities. At the end, the movement received the building of public housing with limited height requirements, and mortgages were made available regardless of race. To demand jobs, unemployment insurance, a fair minimum wage, and education for adults and children, King organized a meet of 2,000 poor people with government officials. But many people of the SCLC thought his goals were too ambitious and didn't go with it. King was assassinated in April 1968 by a sniper while he was standing on a hotel balcony in Memphis. After his assassination, there were many riots in more than 100 cities. SCLC decided to go with the campaign, but it didn't achieve any of the major goals they hoped it would. The Congress did also pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death marked the end of an era in American history. Let's watch his last famous speech, "I've Been to the Mountaintop."
Say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Martin Luther King fought against segregation. The most famous move was the Montgomery bus boycott. He wanted voting rights for African Americans and is responsible for the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The third main thing he stood for was his fight for the poor. Examples for that are the Chicago movement and the Poor People's Campaign. Martin Luther King Jr. changed society with his idea of peace. His inspiration for that was Mahatma Gandhi. His decision to stay peaceful was at the end the reason why the civil rights movement was successful. He believed in civil disobedience and nonviolent protests like the sit-ins. His peacefulness wouldn't be changed by anything. No matter how violent the opposite side reached on the protest, he stuck to nonviolence. That set him apart from other civil rights leaders. His belief in nonviolence couldn't be shaken by anything. That brought him to his goal at the end, mainly through the media. People saw the African Americans protesting peaceful and getting attacked in response. It didn't matter if they were men, women, or children. That changed the mind of many people and brought many whites to join the civil rights movement.